at the National Postal Forum, and we're going to talk to Peter more about how he got into this crazy postal sector and what he's been doing these days and what he forecasts or envisions for the future. So let's start with, how'd you get in?
Well, I was a programmer. I was an assembler programmer in the late 60s, and I started probably programming in 64, 65, and moving out of New York, I went to Colorado looking for a job. When I got there, I found a company there by the name of Neo Data Services that at the time was the preeminent magazine subscription fulfillment bureau.
Yeah.
And they were maintaining the files for some 400 magazines. At the time, the largest group of magazines in the country. And obviously they were in the mail business because in those days all of the pre-sort was done at the fulfillment company. Labels were produced, they were sent out to the printers, and the printers simply, put them on the magazines and loaded them into the trucks. So all of the computer work was done at the point of label production. And of course, in those days we were using printed labels.
Yes.
Which has been quite a bit changed in recent years. So it's sort of a long story, and a bit of it, because of the timing, is a history of what happened to mail and what happened to distribution.
Well, tell us a little bit about it.
During the 70s, early 70s, we were looking at things like how do we identify address elements, and I did a lot of work with parsing names and addresses and identifying them so that we were able to reach into the data after it came in and pull out certain things so we could make match codes. Because the match code is how we determined whether or not a piece of correspondence related to one subscriber or another.
And I thought the match code also helped eliminate the duplicates.
Well, that was why we wanted to have a unique identification, and this was the way we extracted it, by using address elements. So that was there. Pre-sort didn't happen a great deal. Back then, a lot of sorting consisted of manual operations grouped by zip codes and put into sacks. So we would have sack racks, would be great big racks of sacks, and the girls, it was always the girls, would be taking bundles of mail to a zip code, and they would be throwing it into city groups. They'd be, oh, this one goes to Cleveland, that one's going to Los Angeles, and so on. We had a zip code at the time, but that was the finest level of sortation, other than carrier route for the high-density mailers. Companies like Time were doing some very creative new things, but that was pretty much the state of the art during the 70s. We just gotten the ability to computerize a lot of things, and so we were computerizing all of these operations that were done by previously addressograph plates, metal embossed plates that were used to slam into a piece of paper and create a label that was produced on the magazine. So it was pretty much a change in the way things had always been done. We had an addressing group, and when we had these computerized labels, but the addressing group was left over from the days when you had to manually produce labels, and their function was to count the labels. And by God, they still counted the labels that were produced by the computers to be sure that those computers got the counts right. And it was a room full of blue-haired ladies who had this responsibility. So it was a time of profound change in the late 70s, 76, first class, 77, what was then called second class, now periodicals, and 78, third class and standard mail now, were given discounts for doing pre-sort. But the limitation on the pre-sort was at that point you had to have 20 pounds of mail in a sack, which meant that precious few sacks of pre-sorted mail were getting any discount. Right. You still had to do the preparation, but unless you had 20 pounds, you didn't get a discount. But at the end of 1979, they produced what we called the six-pack rule that said if you had 6 or more pieces in a bundle, it could put, or package as it was called at the time, and you put it in a sack with 3 other packages, you could get a rate. So if you had 4 carrier route packages that were going to the zip code that handled those carrier routes, you got a discount.
That's great.
Well, it was super because now this suddenly made it a viable proposition. So we developed, actually Neodata was one of the very first to have this company I worked for at the time, and I wrote this stuff, the first pre-sorts that took advantage of this 6-pack rule. And then within short order, we were able to make pallets as well. But the pallet rules were a lot more restrictive then than they are now. You have to have 750-pound minimums and so on, which was
That's a lot of mail.
a lot of mail.
Yeah.
So there was a big need for standardization, and in the early 1981 actually, Graphic Communications Association, GCA, led by a gentleman by the name of Norm Scharf, who's sadly departed us now. But
I remember Norm.
Norm created a lot of the opportunities that we're now seeing the value of today, and we're taking advantage of today.
Like co-mail?
Well, not quite yet, Jody, but in GCA eventually, as you know, became ID Alliance, and ID Alliance today is very much a force to be reckoned with in the mailing world. GCA was then as well, and in the early 1980s, at GCA's request, I wrote something that was called a pass manual.
Okay.
It was package and sack sequencing, and it became the standard for preparation because up until this point, everybody had their own idea about how to mark a label. When you have a label, for example, on a manual binding line, here comes a stream of mail at you. When do you tie off your package or your bundle?
Yeah, so
you had to put a
there?
mark on.
Right.
Oh, they put asterisks, they put dollar signs, they would put them in different places. It was all over the place, and not everybody was consistent in how they applied that. So what we did is we built a standard, and we documented the standard, and it became very important. Some of the printers, in fact, bought thousands of copies and distributed them to their customers. And it said, look, this is how we want our mail prepared.
Yeah.
So it was a very worthwhile thing. And again, this was driven by GCA. It was nice of Norm to ask me to write it.
Well, you've been a strong contributor in the group.
Well, I was the chairman of the Addressing Distribution Committee up until 1987 or something like that. So I was fortunate to have a
leadership role,
a ringside seat. Let's put it that way. So we built the first palletization in the early '80s, and we argued strongly for applying the same standards to standard flats. And indeed, in the mid '80s, we started to have palletization in standard flats as well. So I was working at Neodata until 1988.
Okay.
The last pass manual was actually in 1987. I have a copy of it at home, and it has first class, second class, third class, fourth class, Canadian mail, and palletization.
Okay.
All of that was in this book, and I think by the time the smoke cleared, probably 30 or 40,000 copies of the pass manual. It was a bestseller. Were printed. I still get residuals.
Yes, I can imagine.
Oh yeah, they're very valuable. But then in the early '90s, we were looking at some other things that were very
early
important.
'90s was the introduction of dropship.
Well, that's where, yes, indeed, dropship was happening all along. In fact, back in the olden days, when we were doing all of the pre-sort at the fulfillment companies, or or for those like Time, Newsweek, Reader's Digest, who did their own work in-house. Meredith did their own work in-house, rather than have it done by a fulfillment company. They would do the drop ship analysis there, or they would have a set of entry points, which we call the dispatch scheme.
Okay.
So it would be like all of these zip codes would be grouped together, and it would go to New Jersey, and another one would go to, Chicago, and so forth and so on. And that was the way it was done. So we had our dispatch schemes, and they were largely manually determined. They didn't change from job to job, from day to day, from month to month. and that's what the printers did.
Right.
So that was drop ship. But in the early 90s, kind of jumping over an awful lot in the middle here.
Well, is there something you don't want to jump over?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
There's too much.
I want to get to the part where you got interested in costing.
Oh well, that's another story. But in the early 90s, one of the problems that was happening is mail that was being entered locally wasn't really accepted until it got to the entry point. So I mean, you would be producing it in Chicago, you'd be loading up trucks, and you'd get to San Francisco or Dallas or someplace else, and somebody would look at it and they'd say, there's something wrong with this mail, and printers would have to get on a plane, literally, and send a crew to rework the mail or risk hundreds of thousands of dollars of additional postage, which was, of course, the publisher's responsibility to pay.
Yeah.
They weren't being co-mailed at the time, so it was individual publications in most cases that were dealing with this. So what happened is we are agitated for, and again, this is largely through GCA, we agitated for a way to, and I was serving on MTAC. I was on MTAC for 1980 on.
In a lot of different roles, right?
All for 20 plus years for GCA, as a GCA representative. But through MTAC as well, we agitated for some way to get it all accepted at point of origin, irrespective of where the mail was going to be given over to the Postal Service.
That's a tremendous difference.
And that was what we call and this was, I think, in 1991, plant verified drop shipment came into play. This was a giant move forward. And one of the concerns that we have today, leaping forward into today's world with something like seamless acceptance, is that by no longer being able to be assured that your mail was going to be handled as you prepared it for the price that you had agreed to pay when it was given over to the Postal Service at that additional entry, are we going to lose that is the great concern, because it was an enormous step forward when we could feel sure that what we had paid for, and you've got it, it's okay, here's our documentation, here's our mail, you verified it, great. And now it goes out and we're done with the financial transactions. If we lose that, that's a big problem.
It is a risk of seamless. I mean, the assumption is that you prepared the mail according to the regs, and now it's going through the system. So if there's any sort of bleep in the system, there's no way for us to know as non-postal people that it wasn't a postal issue.
Well, exactly. You have to go, you're sort of guilty till proven innocent in this case. And your truck of mail that leaves Arizona and goes to Louisiana picks up moisture along the way, and suddenly the pieces weigh more.
Yes.
That's somehow not fair. But sort of going back into the Wayback Machine, part of the other thing, I first got involved with MTAC in 1978. They had a thing called the Computer Interface Task Force. And the Computer Interface Task Force was working in the industry and the Postal Service to do what was called initially 9-digit zip code coding.
Oh, okay.
So we were working with the Postal Service, some of us, to code or establish a coding structure for the country. This became the 9-digit zip code, and then the zip +4, and as now we render it in different ways, intelligent mail barcodes and so on. And we made a movie at the time called Zip +4, What's in It for Me, with Jim McKay, and some leaders from the industry, and I was fortunate to be in that. We had a lot of pushback from the industry that said we don't see a value to this,
That's interesting.
Yeah. I was very enthused about the possibilities of using the Zip +4 as a key to demographics for marketing purposes.
That makes sense.
And I did some work. We eventually, my company then, became part of Dun & Bradstreet. It was part of A.C. Nielsen, and A.C. Nielsen essentially got acquired by Dun & Bradstreet. And we had Donnelly Marketing.
Right.
And we had Nielsen Clearinghouse, Nielsen Media.
Very convenient.
It was very powerful stuff, and we tried to bring all of that together into, into marketing.
Okay.
So mail was one medium, You know, there was television, there was radio, there were
Yes.
all these other things that could be
print.
done too, and print. Yeah. So we tried to bring all that together, but unfortunately, through lack of vision and, you know, certain quarters, it didn't ever really gel. And it was sad because it was a moment that passed, and I still regret it, lo these many years later. So in the 90s also, one of the things that was happening, and this was sort of concurrent with the plant verified drop ship, all the drop shipping that was going on, people were starting to look at entry points. Joe Lubino, who was one of the real thought leaders in this whole thing, developed some software at Donnelly to do entry point evaluation. They even got a patent on it in the 80s.
Yeah.
And fellows like Chris Lean, working at C.H. Robinson, were doing analysis to determine where good entry points were, which were cost effective for a mailer to go to. A fellow by the name of Fred Seymour had someone,
Yeah.
good old Fred. Fred P. Seymour, he said the P stood for pallet. But he was a big proponent of palletization, and he had somebody develop for him what he called the freight planner.
Okay.
And it was used for dropship analysis. And so we had a lot of interest in these things in the early...
In those days, did the freight plan take into consideration that, let's say, one postal facility performed better than another?
Well, sometimes, yeah, right, but it was more anecdotal, you know, oh my God, you don't want to go into Metuchen or something, you know, it was that kind of thing. Because, you know, freight, postal entry points aren't exactly fungible, as you know. And some of them can do things, others can't. They've got different hours of operation, and so on. So we were needing to communicate better what was being done now that we had dynamics in play to the printer.
Right.
So the printer was saying, you got to tell me what's coming, because it's not the same thing every month. And we, again, through GCA, developed a container file.
Oh, I remember the container file.
And the container file's primary function was to go from whomever it was that produced the labels and did the sort to the printer to allow them to determine what their loading plan needed to be.
And in a way, it was sort of the precursor to mail.dat.
Well, it was very much a precursor to mail.dat. That's how it evolved. As long as we know this, well, we need to have something that describes a job. And as long as we know this, what's the piece look like? And what's more detail about that container? And what do the packages look like? We have a package quantity file, a container quantity file. And so the mail.dat, which is essentially a relational database, was built initially by a core of about 3 or 4 of us, you know,
at GCA.
At GCA.
Yeah.
It's all been GCA and now ID Alliance, to where it evolved to today. The funny thing is along the way, mail.dat is everything you need to know about a mailing except the name and address.
Right, and that's what Addis was for.
Well, Addis is another story, but I'll get back to that. But we fought. We said, please, Postal Service. I remember talking to Postmaster General Jack Potter and saying, Jack, would you guys please take these files? This is everything you need in order to deal with postage. And he said, well, it's some other guy's job in the Postal Service. It's his job to make it happen. He's got to sell it to me. And now, of course, we have got the Postal Service so on board that it's required.
Yes.
So be careful we're kind of riding the tiger here, aren't we?
Yeah, there's very few ways to enter mail without a mail.dat.
Absolutely. But Addis was another attempted standardization, and what had happened was that we were using these paper labels, and in the 70s we used what were called Mead. There were Mead machines.
Okay, and then they moved to Avery.
No, it was AB Dick Videograph.
Yeah.
And AB Dick Videograph, which is a lovely story, is the one guy in the world who blew the imaging tubes for these 17 videograph machines which were around the country that everybody used. Time had several, Newsweek had several, we had several at Neodata, CDS had some. But anyway, there were only 17 in the whole world. The guy at Corning who blew the imaging tubes, because of course they all had to be done by hand, retired.
Oh.
it brought the industry to a complete halt. There was no way to produce the imaging tube. It was a wonderful human moment. And so we started casting about for alternatives, and we found Kodak, we found Mead, we found people that we could talk to that would be able to produce some alternative, and that's where we went to inkjet.
All right.
And
now inkjet's hardly used.
And now inkjet, but what we had is we had an inkjet file rather than having the file that was used on these Meads, which were located in these very discrete locations. All these people had inkjet capability. Now we needed to be able to tell them what was on the inkjet tape.
Because the inkjet tape was print image ready, and it wasn't pure data. It was ready to go.
It was ready to go. And so what we did is we built, again, this was led by a fellow by the name, the editor of this was Mark Ryan, who was at Donnelly.
Okay.
He was actually Joe Lubino's boss. And Mark was a great guy, still active in the industry. And Mark was the editor. I had sort of the concept. I was the guy who had the concept. And the concept essentially is, and I do use this in other applications before, is let's put at the beginning a dictionary that basically describes what the elements are that we're going to find in here, where they are, and how long they are. So it didn't matter how you laid out your inkjet file. All that mattered is that you had the dictionary at the front.
That sounds sort of pre-XML.
That's exactly what it was, yeah. And I'd done something like that in the 60s in other database applications and
before your time.
In a former life, yeah. So that's what ADIS was this standard, which was written again GCA, all GCA leadership, and we created that, and I've got that in my closet along with the old.
Not used as much as mail.dat though. It's unclear why.
But
it wasn't, the uptake wasn't very quick.
But Joe Lubino is doing similar things. He's taken that and he's using it in some of the work that he's done with the UPU.
Right.
In his address standardization, which I wish Joe were here to explain, because
well, we'll catch him and we'll make him
you
put
better,
it on video.
You better do that. So anyway.
So tell us a little bit more about the journey that you've experienced before you forecast for us what future you'd like to see.
Well, the other part of it that happened in the late 90s is it was pretty clear that the Postal Service costs in periodicals and standard mail weren't being covered. And I had some software that I'd written that dealt with pre-sorting.
Yep.
I called it pre-sort analyzer. And it enabled you to look at what would happen if I prepared mail differently.
Choices.
So I talked to the people at MPA were very interested in seeing...
Magazine Publishers Association,
Publishers Association, yeah. At that point, were very interested in seeing how costs were being covered and why they were covered so poorly. So they spoke with me and asked me to do a little something to help on that. And I got a library reference 332, which was one of the things the Postal Service always filed when they were doing their rate cases, which talked about their costs. And I brought it into my software and I treated it like it was a set of rates. And I compared it because I could do one set of rates versus another set of rates. So I used the costs that they had versus the price that we were given to see whether or not the costs, certain preparations were better or worse in terms of cost. And the answer was very many of the preparations that we're doing were not cost effective for the Postal Service. And so Time was terribly interested in this all at the same time. They were pushing forward. So in the early 2000s, we were all moving in the same direction, largely Time and me. Time even had me doing some work for them for a while. When Jack Potter became Postmaster General, the first week he was in, I knocked on his door. I sat down with Jack and with Anita Bizzotto, who was the Chief Marketing Officer, Senior VP of Marketing at the time. And I went through for an hour how their rules and rates were part of the problem. Were part of the problem, and why we were unable to cover the costs.
And they saw it right away?
Jack right away said, "Oh my gosh, I wish I'd had this." But Jack now he's the Lord High Poobah, and he doesn't have the ability to actually do anything. That's one of the problems. I don't know why they're called executives. They can't execute anything. So anyway, Jack's up there in the clouds and saying, "Yes, indeed, up here from Mount Olympus, it certainly looks like that's the right thing to do." But it didn't happen, and Postal Service hired me to do some rate modeling for them because I acquired a certain expertise.
And there was a fellow inside the Postal Service that you collaborated with.
Don O'Hara.
Yes.
Oh, a wonderful guy, super bright guy, not necessarily one who the Postal Service found easy to understand. He was a little like the professor in Back to the Future. And
so you were sort of translating.
I understood him, which was
amazing all by itself.
Amazing all by itself. No, he's a super bright guy,
Yeah.
but he liked all this, and we worked along these lines. And concurrent with this, toward the end of it, what happened is Time filed a complaint.
Yes.
With the Postal Rate Commission, predecessor to the 2006, end of 2006, and what happened is the Postal Rate Commission came out and they said, Postal Service, you will institute these granular rates for periodicals that consisted of piece cost, bundle, sack, pallet, and pounds.
And
very granular costs.
did it get done?
Well, interestingly enough, at the end of 2006, the Postal Rate Commission was killed off.
Yeah.
Long live the Postal Regulatory Commission, which came into power but no longer had the same authorities as the Rate Commission. They were supposed to make sure that the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act provisions were followed in the rates, in essence, afterwards. So in 2007, July, they put the new rate structure into effect. But sadly, the Postal Service did it kind of unwillingly, and they only passed a little bit of the costs through. Here, the theory was this, Jody. If you are able to pass through into the prices the costs and allow the mailers to respond to those price incentives in there, what you'll ultimately do by their preparing mail, which is less costly for them, the mailer, will also drive out postal costs because the price and the cost are essentially tied together.
And this is a simple explanation for work sharing.
It's a simple explanation. Well, no, listen, work sharing is a little different, but okay. Let's
clarify.
Let's just leave that alone for the moment. Cost-based pricing is a very different thing. And it's tied to a notion called efficient component pricing, which is if you put a price on something which is related to the cost, the entity who may execute whatever needs to be executed most efficiently will do so. So your component then, like if I can make up a sack and I can do it cheaper than the Postal Service can do it, I'll make up that sack. If I can't, I won't. They've got to do it.
Right.
But they're more efficient at it because I looked at the price and the price reflected the cost. Okay. So that would be better for them to do it, you see?
Yes.
Or if I go to a particular consolidation, a sectional center facility, and I don't find it to be cost effective for me to do so, maybe I'll go to an area distribution center in a higher level because the cost there, it makes sense for me, which means that since the Postal Service's price that they gave me for the sectional center facility was too high for me, it must mean that it would be more efficient for them to do the work.
That's the principle.
That's the principle behind the whole thing.
Okay.
So the problem was that in 2007, when they did this, what they didn't do is pass through the costs. They only passed through a little bit of the costs.
Yeah.
And so you had these rate elements that didn't have enough incentive in them to actually make anybody do anything. So fast forward a little bit, 2012, I did some analysis. I did another set of rate analysis things for the Postal Service in that time. We found some interesting things. At the time, they were only passing through 25% of the sack cost, 35% of the bundle cost and 49% of the pallet cost, which meant that we didn't have
Proper incentives.
reasonable incentives. They didn't
Right.
even, there wasn't even a reasonable ratio. I mean, if they were 50% of each,
Yeah, that would have been
it might be a
consistent.
little bit better, but they weren't. And so you got these disincentives. And then I figured out how to write some optimization software. So I wrote some pre-sort optimization software that essentially said, look, if my cost of going to this new level is I need to produce a new bundle, and that bundle is going to cost me $4, am I going to save enough on the pieces that go into that bundle and get a pre-sort rate that is better than the one they would otherwise get to offset the cost of that $4 bundle? And if I do, I make it. If I don't make it. That's optimization in a nutshell. Well, I applied that not to bundles because I was working with mail.dat files, which are bundle-based. I did that on containers, and I looked at the containers and I said, okay, what containers would I make using optimization if I used today's rates? But then what I did is I had the postal costs.
Oh.
So I took the real postal cost and I said, okay, and what would happen if I optimized based on cost? Wow. What would happen is suddenly I was making a whole different set of containers. Things that were going to the area distribution center were going to the sectional center. They're
much better for delivery.
Much better for delivery, much better for service, much better for the Postal
Oh,
Service.
it's the triple win.
In terms of cost.
Yep.
So, but the problem is, A, they weren't passing the costs through.
Right.
B, you couldn't do it because they had rules that were written back in 1978.
Okay.
About how mail had to be prepared, where it needed to be sorted to the finest level possible because somebody was going to take that and they were going to stick it into a Franklin case. And so is a guy sitting there, again, casing the mail by hand. And so the assumption was the finest level possible. That's still the guiding principle in pre-sort today.
Yes.
It's an archaic rule. And went in 2007 when the Postal Service finally begrudgingly put these new structures into place, they said, oh, well, now mailers are going to have new price incentives.
Yeah.
Problem is, their hands are still tied. I could swim.
Because of the mail prep rules.
I could swim really well if my hands weren't tied. And now in May of last year, 2015, what they did is they passed through a very large percentage of the bundle costs, a very large percentage of the pallet costs, and a modest. They didn't change anything on the sacks. The sacks are still the same old, whatever it is, 49% that they'd finally gotten up to by last year. And we don't quite know what the effect is of that because the Postal Service has to file an annual compliance report,
And
as you
we're in the
know.
middle of that season, I think.
And they filed it already,
It's
but there were
December
only
27th.
only 3 months in there. There was May through.
Oh, right. Because the price change happened in May, so there's not that much data.
Yeah, right. June, July, and
Right.
August, and then went
Right.
September, and so we've only got a quarter's worth of data in there, and so we don't quite know what happened. But here's the thing: we still have the same rules, and we've got the same constraints, and we're still not passing through as much as we should be. But the logic of that, and this has been a personal mission of mine for these many years now.
And you've been talking to the new Postmaster General about it.
I've talked to Megan about it. I talked to Joe Corbett earlier today.
Good.
I believe that this structure should be applied to standard mail flats as well.
Yes.
Because standard mail flats is similarly, as they say, underwater. The cost.
Well, and maybe BPM flats just so you can co-mail.
Well, BPM, they're talking about combining standard and BPM.
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense. I mean, something which weighs 15.999 ounces adds another 0.1 ounce to its weight, and suddenly it's a different class of mail. It makes absolutely no sense. Standard mail, one of the other things is there's no distance component in it.
That's a miss.
Yeah. One bound printed matter, by virtue of it being so heavy, is zoned, but standard mail is not zoned.
So we can anticipate standard being zoned, perhaps, when it gets renamed?
Well, I would encourage that, but nobody's listening to me necessarily, you know.
Well, maybe they'll listen to
If
the
it were
video.
my postal service, I would have done things differently some time ago. So I would say that the idea is not to get it to be less costly necessarily for the mailer. I mean, that'd be great. If we could drive rates down, great. Well, what we need to do, though, is we do have to cover postal costs.
Yes.
And there are two ways to do it. One is to pay more money. I'm not in favor of that. And the other is to prepare more efficient mail that reduces the Postal Service's costs.
Which we should be in a good position to do.
But they are
if
their
there
own
weren't
worst enemy
rules in the way.
because of the rules
Right.
and the fact that they don't necessarily give the best rate signals. Now the other side of it is, and this is a bit of a red herring. They drag out every once in a while. They say, well, we're not entirely sure about those costs, whether they're so good. Well, Postal Service, if you're not sure about the costs, please don't use them to measure or not to measure us to determine whether or not we're covering them. You know?
Right.
Leave us alone about cost coverage if you don't believe in the cost. One or the other.
And so you're hoping for that for the rate review.
Well, I would love it if the Postal Service would do this on their own. It seems to me that, you know, if you want to improve your costs, one sure way to do it is to use them for your pricing.
And I was hoping they were going to use the Intelligent Mail barcode as a way to validate the costs.
Well, that's a very good idea, yeah. So where we go from here is anybody's guess. But the Postal Service is plowing new ground. We don't know what next year is going to bring. Commissioner Acton was at a session we did yesterday, and I explicitly asked him what the authorities were of the Rate Commission and what their objective is going to be in this. And he said, well, you know, basically that's at issue. The lawyers all have got different opinions. The Postal Service says it's this, and we think it's that. Some of the mailing industry thinks it's the other thing. So it remains December 21st of this year.
When they start.
They'll file open a rate case at the commission.
And then the lawyers are all.
And the lawyers will all on it, and that'll be.
It won't be clear
very
for
interesting.
us.
It won't be clear at all.
Yeah.
But the other thing is I don't think the commission is going to come in and say, okay, you guys are only covering 75% of your cost. You have to cover 100% of their cost, because they recognize that actually a 33% increase would wipe out various industries.
Almost nobody could afford a 33%.
They can't afford it, and what would happen is that we would have a reduction in volume with the same fixed cost, which means that you would have created a worse environment for those who remained in the system.
So what do you want to see in the next short period of time?
Well, I would love to see there's an effort at simplification underway, and I'm not quite sure what simplification really means, but they cite, for example, they have a Notice 123 list of rates. It's 68 pages long.
Yeah.
And they're fond of saying periodical rates are so complicated. I will submit for evidence, Your Honor, that periodical rates are covered nonprofit, classroom, in-county, outside county, everything on one page of that 68.
Oh.
Because it's tabular,
Right.
It's simple, it's granular. You say, what level of piece is this? What level of bundle is this?
And then
what container is it? And where is it being entered? What does it weigh?
That's 4 components.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's done. It's all done by computers. So
I think that's fine.
What do we care if a person what do we care if a person is able to replicate it? Because people can't replicate it now, no matter what you do. And yet standard mail rambles all over these multiple pages, and if it's not this, then it moves over onto that page and different categories. It's horrific. So, you know, simplify it so that we can use it effectively on computers and go with the cost-based
Well, I was
pricing.
hoping the mail prep rules would actually relate to what's in the best interest of both parties.
Well, if the mail prep rules, if you were to strike that one phrase, finest level possible.
Yeah, that would take care of it.
Yeah, and if you were to permit certain logical minimums, I mean, I don't think anybody wants a 50-pound pallet.
And
It
nobody
doesn't
wants
make
to go
any
back
sense.
to a 6-piece bundle, right?
Well, a 6-piece bundle is fine in certain cases.
So then it's just about the containerization.
Jerry Faust did some analysis that showed that for carrier route, a 3-piece or a 4-piece bundle could be a very good idea for carrier route.
Oh, great.
But is that practical for the printer? So you need to look at the
probably
entire
not.
the entire supply chain. Can the printer produce this effectively? Are they able to stage that 100-pound pallet? No. Are they able to handle a 2-piece bundle? No, of course not.
Sure.
But within certain limits, if it's a June Brides that weighs 4 pounds, yeah,
Or
you
the
might,
September Vogue.
or the September Vogue, yeah, you might be able to make a 2-piece bundle. Might be a great idea.
Yeah.
So
seasonally.
right, no, but the point is allow the costs and
To drive
the
packaging.
process.
Right.
The packaging, the sacking, the palletizing, and the entry points.
Okay. So where do you want to end up in this conversation?
I think we may have already done so.
Great.
I'd say.
Well, then I'll thank you for stopping by and talking to us about
Thank you very
these
much for
crazy
asking me,
things
Jody.
about rates and mail sorting. Yeah,
It's always a pleasure.
it is.